For the people on these flights, everything felt normal, right up until the end. The pilots were calm, the cabin was quiet, and the aircraft was doing exactly what it was told. The trouble was that it had been told to go to the wrong place. Far from where anyone believed, these crews flew on with total confidence, never knowing they were lost until the ground rose up to meet them. For 2 days, a country searched for a plane that had vanished into thin air. A routine domestic flight in Brazil had radioed that it was about to make a forced landing somewhere in the dark, then disappeared completely. Rescuers combed the rainforest around the city it was supposed to reach and found nothing, because they were looking in entirely the wrong place. The plane had come down more than 1,000 kilometers away, in the opposite direction from where anyone thought to look. How a short evening hop ended up that far off course remains one of the strangest mysteries in aviation history. The aircraft was a Boeing jetliner, the workhorse of the national airline, on the last short leg of a long milk run that had hopped its way north across the country all afternoon. The final stretch, from a town called Marabá up to the river city of Belém, was supposed to take less than 40 minutes. There were 54 people aboard. The trouble began on the ground, with a single number on a sheet of paper. The captain pulled out the printed flight plan to find the heading to Belém. The airline had recently started printing these headings with an extra digit, so the true course of 027 degrees appeared on the page as 0270. Nobody had clearly explained this change to the crews. The captain read that figure as 270 and dialed 270 degrees into his navigation display. The first officer set his to match. The difference seems tiny on paper, but it was catastrophic. The correct heading pointed them north toward Belém. The heading they entered pointed them due west into the heart of the Amazon. The plane lifted off into the late afternoon haze and turned the wrong way. The crew expected to spot the city within minutes, but the first officer could not raise the Belém radio beacon, and he could not reach the control tower either. He assumed the equipment was just being temperamental, the way it often was in the remote north. In reality, the signals were silent, because they were nowhere near Belém, and the transmitters were far out of range. The minutes passed, and the city refused to appear. The navigation computer counted down the distance to the destination, reached 0, then kept counting into the negative. Still, the crew flew on, certain Belém had to be just ahead. When they had gone 30 miles past the point where the city should have been, the captain decided they must have flown over it without seeing it through the haze. So he turned the plane around and started flying back the way he had come, searching for a city that had never been in front of him at all. What followed was an hour of mounting confusion in the gathering dark. The first officer tuned in to a faint radio station he believed was broadcasting from Belém, and the needle pointed off to one side, so the captain swung toward it and began following a wide river he was sure must be a branch of the Amazon. It was the wrong river and the wrong station, both far to the south. They were flying deeper into the wilderness with every minute, chasing landmarks that meant the opposite of what they thought. Only after an hour of following that river did the pilots finally grasp the truth. They had taken off heading west instead of north. They were lost over one of the emptiest places on Earth, with no radar to help them and their fuel running out. Fear settled over the cockpit, and it gave way not to panic, but to a quiet resignation. The captain told the passengers, untruthfully, that the aircraft had suffered an instrument failure and that they would make a forced landing when the fuel ran out. The left engine starved and fell silent. Then the right one followed, and the plane lost almost all its power. Outside there was nothing but blackness, broken only by the distant glow of a forest fire. The pilots raised the nose to stretch the glide and braced for an impact they could not see coming. Then the plane began tearing through the treetops. Towering trees battered the fuselage and ripped both wings away, and the body slammed down into the floor of the rainforest and ground to a halt. Astonishingly, most of the people aboard survived the landing itself, including both pilots. A number of passengers were killed as seats tore loose, but the majority lived. Their ordeal was far from over. The plane's emergency beacon was an old model that only transmitted underwater, so it sent no signal on dry land, and rescuers spent the next day searching far away in the wrong direction. The survivors waited beside the wreckage for more than 2 days, running short of water in a forest that offered none nearby. In the end, 12 people were lost, and 42 lived, saved only when a small group hacked their way through the jungle and stumbled onto a remote cattle ranch that was not even on the map. When investigators examined the flight, they confirmed there had been nothing wrong with the airplane. Every instrument worked. The entire disaster had grown from a single misread number, made worse by 2 pilots who never stopped to question how they could be flying west to reach a city that lay to the north. The clues had been there the whole time, in the silent beacons and the unfamiliar river, but the crew read each one to fit the answer they wanted. It stands today as perhaps the largest navigational error ever made by an airliner. A few meters would have saved them. If the plane had been flying just 35 feet higher, it would have cleared the ridge, and the passengers would have started their vacation. Instead, a long chain of small misunderstandings, none of them fatal alone, stacked up one on top of another until they put the aircraft exactly low enough to strike a mountain it could not see. It was carrying Italian tourists toward the Caribbean, and it came down on a tiny island in the middle of the Atlantic, killing all 144 people aboard. The flight had left northern Italy that morning, bound eventually for the Dominican Republic, flown by an American charter airline using an aging Boeing 707. The jet did not have the range to cross the ocean in one go, so a fuel stop was planned at Santa Maria, a small island in the Azores that had once been a busy waypoint for transatlantic flights, but had long since faded into quiet. In command were 3 pilots, and the crew was thin on experience for the task. The first officer in particular had earned his rating on this aircraft only 2 weeks earlier, and had never flown anything this large or this far from home before. From the moment they neared the island, communication with the local controller was a struggle. The first officer repeatedly had to ask for things to be repeated, unable to follow the controller's strong accent over a crackling radio. This set the tone for everything that followed, a slow pile-up of words misheard and never corrected. The first crack was a navigation choice. The approach was meant to begin at one radio beacon north of the airport, but the crew's charts did not make this clear, so they steered instead toward a different beacon, on a line that happened to pass directly over the island's highest peak. On almost any other day, this would not have mattered, because the minimum safe altitude on the chart would have kept them well above the mountain. The problem was that they were about to descend below it. The errors came, one after another. The controller read out a cloud report that, garbled over the speaker, left the pilots believing the sky was clear below a height that was actually well above the peak. Then he cleared them to 3,000 feet, but the first officer heard 2,000, and no one corrected him. At the very instant the first officer read back the wrong altitude, the controller was transmitting his own message, and because the radio could not send and receive at once, the two canceled each other out. Neither side heard the mistake. The captain seemed to try to fix it, muttering to make it 3,000, but the first officer had already set the system to level off at 2,000, low enough to clip the mountain. There was still one last piece. The controller gave a barometric pressure setting that was badly wrong, off by an amount that would imply a violent storm was bearing down on the island, when in fact, it was an ordinary day. Such a change in a matter of minutes was physically impossible, and both pilots noticed it seemed odd, but neither challenged it. The first officer dialed it into the altimeters anyway. That single wrong number made every altitude reading 240 feet too high. Now the trap was complete. The jet was set to fly over the peak at a height that would just barely hit it, while the altimeters cheerfully showed them safely above, and they waited to break out of cloud at any second. As they pushed into the clouds rolling off the mountain, the ride turned rough, and the captain wrestled to hold the aircraft steady. And here, the strangest thing of all happened. For 7 full seconds the alarm screamed, and not one of the 3 pilots said a word or moved to climb. Then the warning was cut off by the sound of impact. The jet struck a ridge just below the summit at over 400 kilometers an hour and was torn into thousands of pieces. Everyone aboard died at once. The silence in those final seconds was the heart of the mystery. A pull-up alarm almost always leaves enough time to react, and given how close they came to clearing the ridge, even a moment's response would have lifted them the few feet they needed. Investigators found the answer back home, in how the airline trained its pilots. It had no simulator of its own, and sent crews to practice on aircraft set up differently, where the alarm tended to go off on perfectly normal approaches. Instructors dealt with this by switching the alarm off, or simply telling trainees to ignore it. The pilots had been taught, in effect, that this warning was a nuisance to be tuned out, and when a real one sounded, they did exactly as they had been conditioned to do: nothing. When investigators traced it all back, no single failure had doomed the flight. The misheard altitude, the impossible pressure setting, the ignored alarm, every one of them had to happen for the disaster to occur. Pull any single thread and the people aboard would have lived. It stands as the worst air disaster in Portugal's history. This was not supposed to be a dangerous flight. It was a day out, a scenic tour of the most remote place on Earth, with champagne and gourmet meals and an Antarctic expert pointing out the wonders below. The passengers had paid for the trip of a lifetime, a chance to see a frozen continent that almost no one ever reaches. None of them knew that the route programmed into the aircraft had been quietly changed the night before, and that it now pointed them directly at a mountain they could not see. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, a large, wide-body jet flying out of Auckland on a long loop down to Antarctica and back. The airline had been running these sightseeing flights for 2 years, and they were wildly popular. On this trip, there were 257 people aboard, filling the cabin with cameras and excited chatter as the white wilderness slid past the windows far below. The crew navigated using an advanced computer system that followed a string of coordinates loaded before departure. As long as those coordinates were correct, the aircraft would trace the exact path the airline intended, with no need for the ground beacons that barely existed this far south. The captain and his first officer had attended a briefing weeks earlier, where they were shown the planned route on a map. That route ran straight down a wide channel called McMurdo Sound, with the great volcano of Mount Erebus safely off to one side. What the pilots did not know was that the coordinates had been altered. The night before the flight, the airline corrected what it believed was a small error in the stored route, shifting the final waypoint. The change was not small at all. It moved the path more than 40 kilometers to the east, off the open water of the Sound, and directly over the towering bulk of Mount Erebus. Nobody told the crew. They loaded the new coordinates, believing they would fly the same gentle route down the channel they had been shown on the map, never realizing that a single digit had moved their course on top of a mountain. As the flight neared Antarctica, the crew talked to the controllers at the American base at McMurdo and began descending to give the passengers a better view. They found a clear gap beneath the cloud and dropped low, down to around 1,500 feet, flying in good visibility with the sunlit ice stretching out ahead. Everything looked exactly as they expected. They believed they were heading down the middle of the open Sound, but they were not over the Sound. They were flying straight at the lower slopes of Mount Erebus, and they could not tell. The reason was a deadly trick of the light called a whiteout. When an even layer of cloud sits above an unbroken field of snow, the light bounces between them until every shadow disappears, and the ground, the horizon, and the sky all blend into a single sheet of featureless white. The rising face of the volcano ahead of them looked no different from the level ice they were expecting. There was nothing to see, no shadow, no warning that the land in front of them was climbing. In the cabin, passengers kept taking photographs through the windows, capturing a calm and beautiful scene right up to the final moments. In the cockpit, the crew remained relaxed and confident, certain they knew where they were. Then, in the last few seconds, the ground proximity alarm suddenly came alive, calling out for them to pull up. The captain immediately pushed the engines to full power and tried to climb, but the slope had risen beneath them too quickly, and there was no time and no room left. The jet struck the side of the mountain at high speed and was torn apart, scattering across the ice. Everyone aboard was killed instantly. When the wreckage was found high on the volcano, the country was stunned, and the search for answers turned into one of the most bitter sagas in its history. The first official investigation blamed the pilots, concluding that they had descended too low while unsure of their position. But a second inquiry, led by a determined judge, tore that conclusion apart. He found that the crew had not been uncertain at all. They were completely confident, and they had every right to be, because they were flying the route they had been shown, unaware that the airline had moved it onto a mountain without telling them. He placed the blame squarely on the airline and accused it of trying to bury the truth behind what he memorably called an orchestrated litany of lies. The deeper lesson of the disaster was simple and chilling. The pilots did everything they thought was right, and they still died, because the map in their heads no longer matched the world outside. They had been handed a course that led to a mountain, told it led to open water, and given no reason to doubt it. Most lost pilots at least know how high they are. This crew did not even have that. On a dark night over the Pacific, every instrument that told them their speed and their height was feeding them lies, and for nearly half an hour they wrestled with a jet that seemed to be flying too fast and too slow and at the wrong altitude all at once. They were not lost over a map. They were lost inside their own cockpit, unable to trust a single number in front of them. Late that night, a Boeing 757 left the Peruvian capital for a short hop down to Chile, carrying 70 people. Earlier in the day, it had been in for maintenance, and during the work, technicians cleaned the underside of the fuselage. To protect a row of small sensors set flush into the skin, called the static ports, they covered them with strips of silver tape. Those ports are where the jet draws its altitude and airspeed information. When the work was finished, nobody took the tape off. It was almost the same color as the metal around it, and in the dim light of the apron, it simply vanished against the fuselage. The captain walked around the aircraft before departure and never spotted it, sitting high above his head in the dark. So the jet took off with its most basic instruments sealed off from the outside air. On the runway, with the trapped air still matching conditions at sea level, everything read correctly. It was only once they climbed away that the trouble began. Within seconds of leaving the ground, The captain saw that his altimeters had frozen, stuck near zero even as the jet climbed. Then, a warning blared that they were flying into wind shear, which made no sense on a calm and quiet night. Confused but still flying, the crew pressed on out over the ocean, trying to hold a steady climb while their instruments drifted further and further from the truth. As they rose, their airspeed began to read far too low, and the captain called for a careful pitch and power setting to keep them safe. It got worse from there. The same baffling caution messages with no obvious cause began to appear, and the autopilot refused to engage. The first officer gave up on the instruments entirely and declared an emergency, telling the tower they had no reliable altitude and no reliable speed. Then he reached for the one outside source he thought he could trust and asked the controller to read their altitude off his radar screen. This seemed like a lifeline, but it was a trap. Air traffic radar does not measure a plane's height on its own. It simply displays the altitude the aircraft itself transmits, which comes from the very same sealed sensors that were already lying to the crew. So when the controller confirmed that his screen showed the same altitude the pilots were seeing, he was unknowingly assuring them that a false number was correct. From that moment on, the crew believed they were thousands of feet higher than they truly were. For the next half hour, the cockpit was chaos. Warnings contradicted one another, with an alarm screaming that they were going too fast, while another warned they were about to stall, both at the same time. The crew argued about which to believe, cursed the maintenance that had done this to them, and slowly lost their faith in everything around them. The truth was that the stall warning was real, and the overspeed warning was false. But with no training for this exact failure, they had no way to tell which was which. All the while, they had two pieces of good information within reach that could have saved them. The controller could give them their true speed across the ground, and once they descended below a couple of thousand feet, a separate device that bounced a signal off the surface could have told them their real height. But they never managed to lean on these in the storm of confusion, because they never felt stable enough to stop and think it through. Convinced they were still high above the ocean, the crew kept trying to descend toward the airport. Their altimeters insisted they had thousands of feet to spare. They did not. In the darkness, with no lights below to judge against, the jet sank lower and lower toward the black water, while the instruments swore they were safe. A terrain alarm began to sound, again and again, but the false altitude readout convinced them it had to be a mistake. Then the left wingtip clipped the surface of the sea. The crew felt the shudder and cried out, and the captain hauled back desperately on the controls, dragging the jet briefly back into the air. But the wing was fatally damaged. The aircraft rolled over despite everything they did, and seconds later it slammed into the Pacific. All 70 people aboard were lost. When the wreckage was recovered, a piece of the lower fuselage came up from the seabed with the strip of silver tape still stubbornly in place. The jet had been mechanically capable of flying the whole time, and the crew had been good pilots fighting hard to save it. They were brought down by a few strips of tape and a fatal gap in knowledge, never taught that the radar could not be trusted, that the stall warning could, and that their true height was within reach the entire time. They spent their final minutes certain of an altitude that did not exist, descending in the dark toward an ocean they could not see. By the time the little aircraft turned toward a small Minnesota town in the dark, the captain was a knot of anger, and his first officer was too afraid to speak. Between them, they would fly a perfectly good airplane into a hillside and never see how low they had fallen until the trees came through the windscreen. The aircraft was a Jetstream 3-100, a small British-built twin turboprop carrying up to 19 people on short regional hops. On this winter evening, it was running from Minneapolis up to the iron mining town of Hibbing, with 18 people aboard. In command was a captain in his early 40s with a long and troubling history, and beside him sat a first officer of 25, still new to the aircraft and still on probation, anxious to impress and acutely aware that a single bad word from his captain could end his career before it began. That fear did not come from nowhere. The captain had a reputation across the airline, and most of the first officers who had flown with him found him intimidating. He had failed check ride after check ride over the years, scraping through only on repeated retries, and his file held complaints of all kinds, including an account of him striking another first officer for a minor mistake. The young man in the right seat had heard those stories before he ever met him. That very evening, before they even left the ground, the captain had already torn into him for a missed item on the pre-flight inspection. By the time they were airborne, the first officer had retreated into himself, saying as little as possible. The flight itself had been nothing but friction. A last-minute schedule change had wiped out the captain's day off. A confrontation with a gate agent had left him seething. A mechanical problem had delayed them, and the aircraft had been over its weight limit until a passenger volunteered to get off. On top of all that waited a difficult approach into Hibbing. the kind that demands close teamwork, flown in low cloud with no easy guidance to the runway in use. Then the captain learned that other crews were picking up ice in the clouds. Worried about ice on his small aircraft, he decided to stay high as long as possible and then drop down fast through the dangerous layer, a trick pilots at the airline passed around among themselves even though no rulebook described it. The problem was that he had already briefed a different plan, and he never told his first officer he had changed it. He simply held altitude past the point where they should have come down, then pushed into a steep dive at more than twice the descent rate the rules allowed. In that cockpit, the first officer's most important job was to watch the altitude and call out when they were sinking too fast or coming up on a level off. He was required to announce any excessive sink rate and several specific heights as they approached the ground. He made almost none of these calls. Beaten down by a stream of criticism and orders, terrified of saying the wrong thing, he had gone quiet at the exact moment his voice was needed most. The captain, for his part, had lost track of how low they were, and at one point even had to ask what altitude they were supposed to level off at. The aircraft hurtled downward through the darkness, already below the lowest safe height for the approach, and neither man was watching. Right at the critical moment, the captain gave his first officer one more trivial task, telling him to switch on the runway lights, a job that should have been done long before. Both pilots became absorbed in flipping that switch. Neither noticed they had sailed straight through the altitude where they were meant to stop descending, with a wooded ridge waiting in the dark ahead. The aircraft was small enough that it carried no ground proximity warning system. Seconds later, the right wing clipped a pine atop the ridge, and the aircraft tore through the trees, rolled and slammed into the far slope. It was over in moments, and all 18 people aboard were lost. It had flown into the ground under full control, brought there by a steep and needless dive. A captain who had lost his place in the sky, and a first officer too afraid to tell him so. The deeper finding was harder to face. The captain should never have still been flying. His record a long trail of warnings that the airline had simply never gathered up and acted upon. He was lost on that approach in every sense, certain of nothing, aware of nothing, until the hill made everything final. Some pilots get lost because their instruments fail them. This one got lost because he stopped listening to everyone around him, including the machine screaming that a mountain lay dead ahead. For more than a minute, as alarms blared and his first officer begged him to turn, the captain of this flight kept steering deeper into the hills outside the Pakistani capital. Convinced he knew where he was, he did not. By the time he understood his mistake, there was nothing left to do but brace for it. The aircraft was an Airbus A321, a stretched single-aisle jet, flying the morning run from Karachi up to Islamabad with 152 people aboard. In the cockpit sat one of the airline's most senior captains, a man with more than 25,000 hours of experience, alongside a young first officer who had only recently started his career. From the moment they left the ground, the older man set the tone for everything that followed. He spent the first hour of the flight quizzing and belittling the younger pilot, picking apart his knowledge of the aircraft, until whatever confidence the first officer had was gone. The weather waiting at Islamabad was miserable. Days of record rainfall had flooded much of the country, and the airport sat under low cloud and heavy rain, hemmed in by mountains to the north and east. The runway in use had no precision guidance to line the plane up automatically, so in conditions like these the proper method was a circling approach. The crew would line up with the airport from one direction, descend to a set minimum height, then fly a carefully timed loop around the field, keeping the runway in sight the entire time. The key rule was simple and absolute. If you lose sight of the airport, you abandon the approach. The captain decided to do it his own way. Rather than fly the published loop with its precise timings, he programmed a series of his own invented waypoints into the navigation computer and let the autopilot fly toward them. The trouble was that these waypoints ran well outside the safe zone the approach was designed to protect, the narrow envelope that guaranteed clearance from the surrounding hills. One of his invented points sat almost on top of the high ground north of the airport. The moment he let the autopilot steer toward it, the plane was aimed at a mountain. He compounded this by pushing the aircraft below the minimum safe altitude to try to glimpse the ground, ignoring the controller's suggestion to simply hold and wait for the weather to clear. He was under pressure because a rival airline had just landed successfully, and he seemed determined to do the same. So the jet pressed on, low and fast, into the murk, toward terrain the crew could not see. Then the ground proximity system came alive, calling out that there was terrain ahead. The first officer immediately urged the captain to turn left, away from the high ground. But here, The captain made his most baffling error of all. He reached for the heading control to steer the plane away, but he had forgotten that the autopilot was still locked in its program navigation mode, which meant his commands did nothing. The plane kept flying straight toward the hills while he turned the knob further and further, wondering why nothing was happening. When he finally switched modes, he had spun the control so far that it now pointed the plane to the right, turning it directly into the mountain instead of away from it. The warnings escalated from a caution to an urgent demand to pull up. The first officer pleaded with him over and over, telling him to turn, to climb, to pull up. The captain's response was weak and confused. Instead of doing the one thing that might have saved them, taking the aircraft in his own hands and hauling it skyward with full power, he kept fixating on turning, rolling the jet steeply onto its side while letting the nose drop. The plane had climbed just high enough that a hard, clean pull might have cleared the ridge, but he never made it. In the final seconds, the first officer was still crying out for him to pull up, his voice rising in desperation, when the jet flew straight into the side of a hill in the Margala range outside the city. The impact destroyed the aircraft instantly and killed everyone on board. When investigators reconstructed the flight, they found nothing wrong with the airplane. It had done exactly what it was told, right into the mountain. In the span of 70 seconds, the captain had ignored more than 20 terrain alarms and nearly a dozen pleas from his own first officer, all while certain he was somewhere safe. The deeper failure was the one inside that cockpit, where a domineering captain had so thoroughly crushed the man beside him that when disaster came, the only person who could see it clearly was too afraid to seize the controls. They were not brought down by a broken machine or even truly by the weather, but by a pilot who lost track of where he was and would not let anyone tell him otherwise. 7 flights, 7 different ways to be lost, and the same quiet truth runs beneath all of them. Not one of these aircraft was broken. The engines ran, the wings held, the controls answered every command. Each machine did exactly what it was asked to do, right up to the moment it carried its passengers into a mountain, a jungle, or the sea. What failed was never the metal. It was the picture in the minds of the people flying, and that picture is the one thing no inspection can ever check. That is the strange horror sitting at the center of this video. We tend to imagine that catastrophe announces itself, that there will be smoke and flame and a desperate struggle before the end. For these crews, there was none of that. The cabin was calm, the seatbelt signs were off. The pilots were relaxed and sure of themselves, certain they knew exactly where they were, and that certainty was the very thing that doomed them. They were not lost the way a nervous traveler is lost, glancing around for a sign. They were lost without the faintest idea they were lost, and that is the most dangerous condition a human being can be in. Think about how little it took in each case. A number misread by a single digit, a piece of tape no one thought to peel away, a line on a chart that pointed at a peak instead of open water. The cause was almost never dramatic, and that is exactly what makes these stories so unsettling. A tiny, ordinary mistake slipped quietly into the cockpit, and from there, it spread outward and rewrote the whole world beyond the windscreen, until the place the crew believed in and the place they were actually flying had drifted completely apart. And once that gap had opened, almost everything the pilots did to close it only pulled them in deeper, because the human mind is built to defend the story it already believes. Faced with evidence that the map is wrong, we do not tear up the map, we argue with the evidence. That is the thread tying all 7 together. Time and again, the warnings were right there in front of them. A radio beacon that refused to answer, an altitude that simply made no sense, a young first officer who could see the danger clearly and tried, too softly and too late, to make his captain hear it. The piece of knowledge that could have saved every soul on board was almost always somewhere inside that cockpit, waiting to be noticed. What was missing was never the information. It was the willingness to stop, to doubt, to set aside pride and rank and say out loud that something here does not add up. The people who died were not careless or stupid. They were trained professionals having an ordinary day, sealed inside a version of reality that felt completely solid. And by the time the truth finally broke through, the ground was already rising to meet them. There is something deeply human in all of this, and that is why these stories refuse to leave us once we have heard them. Every one of us walks around with a map inside our head, a map of where we stand, of how things are, of what is waiting around the next corner. Most days it lines up closely enough with the real world that we never feel the seams. We trust it without a second thought, exactly as those crews trusted theirs. These flights are a reminder of what can happen in the rare moment when the map and the world quietly separate, and we keep moving forward with total confidence, certain of our footing, never thinking to look down. And the cruelest detail, in case after case, is just how close so many of them came to living, A little more height beneath the wheels. A single question asked 1 minute sooner. One unhurried look at the right instrument. The distance between a routine landing and a disaster was more often than not only a few seconds wide. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura.